Hi there, folks. So I've been doing a lot more research trying to find out various topics regarding the alleged pandemic at the moment. And I just want to explain firstly why I, first of all, had doubts that it was a pandemic, and that I came to think early on actually that the fears over it had at least been exaggerated. And I think because the number of cases that have been reported at that point were just so small in comparison to many other widespread infections. Just 10 minutes of research enabled me to simply find out, for example, 3 to 4 million people die of pneumonia globally each year. And the WHO called it a pandemic and called for international policies to be in place when only 200 cases outside of China had been reported at that time, a very tiny number. And very quickly there were all these predictions being made that there would be an excessive death toll, that it would grow exponentially, and it was really the risk of what might happen in the future with the infection, that it might grow. I think it was Neil Ferguson who, from the Economic Institute in London, I think it is, and he made these predictions that the measures here in the UK were based upon, predicting a huge catastrophic number of deaths, and that's later been revised. But he didn't provide any real substantial scientific evidence to prove or justify the claims and the large scale number of deaths that he predicted through his computer modelling. And that's later been contradicted and disputed by numerous other sources. Notably, the Oxford University had various virologists there that had completely different estimates, and we haven't seen Neil Ferguson, discuss why his own estimates were wildly different. He later reduced the number of what his estimates were to a tiny fraction, and he then said and alleged that would be because of the lockdown measures or the social distancing measures here in the UK, and that was just a day or two after the measures. And he again provided no scientific evidence to justify those claims either. Interestingly, he's recently stepped down from his position after it was revealed that he's been out visiting other people. So he obviously wasn't that concerned himself about the spread of infection. His actions at least didn't say that. Do as I say, but not as I do, and always be careful of people that say that. But there's been a widespread number of other virologists and other reports that have really come out with different information, really. The initial WHO mortality rate seemed really bad. It was estimated early on to be 3 to 4%, and that is pretty awful when you consider ordinary influenza, as bad as that is roughly around 0.1%. But those reports were based on studies of people that were already critically ill, and so they didn't give a true perspective of the overall recovery rate. And later subsequent studies have shown now from various countries across the world that testing large numbers of people, the overwhelming vast majority of people will make a recovery from whatever the infection is. And I say that because it's also disputed whether there is one cause of the infection, or whether there are multiple different infections and the testing isn't distinguishing between what those different viral infections are. I'm not a virologist, so I'm having to sort of look at what different experts say and weigh up and consider their opinions, and I'm certainly no expert in that field to sort of pronounce any judgment on it. So I don't really know that. But there is certainly a blogger, I think his name was John Rappaport or something, and he's alleging that there isn't one single cause at all for the infection, that there's multiple different causes, that there are different strains of infections, different pollutants and intoxicants that are really causing different symptoms like pneumonia, and that those things have already been widespread anyway. He also alleges that in China they didn't actually do any specific testing in Wuhan, and that the source of the alleged pandemic there could easily have been the severe smog that's found in many of the heavily polluted cities. So I don't really know, not being a virologist, how authentic his claims or other virological claims are on that. I'm only having to look at and wade through the evidence like anyone else, as much as I'm capable of. My training was in language and not in science, and certainly not in virology specifically. Nevertheless, the general consensus amongst many other virologists does seem to be that the infection or infections are at least not as fatal as they were first thought to be. So they're giving roughly estimates of a mortality rate between somewhere in the region of 0.1 to 0.6%. That some of them are less than influenza, some of them are more. Some of them are 0.05 up to around 0.6%. And that's studies based on large numbers of people, the overwhelming majority of whom would recover from those. And in fact, the overwhelming majority, the studies have shown, already had long-term pre-existing serious health conditions that alone could have caused, or at least played a significant contributing factor to the deaths. So even with the testing and all the claims, we don't really know absolutely what role, if any, COVID-19 is playing on those reported deaths. Even if we were to accept that it does play some contribution to a varying extent in the alleged number of deaths, and I think roughly in the UK that stands at about 20,000, I think globally it's about 200,000. Even so, the reactions to those and the type of measures in terms of the lockdown, the widespread social isolationism or social distancing, whatever semantics you choose, and together with all the shutdown of various small businesses and the illegalizing, the criminalizing of groups meeting up, the banning of fates, fairs, festivals, churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, community centres, support groups, and so on. All of that seems a gross and way over the top, exaggerated reaction to it. When you consider, 200,000 are alleged to have died globally from COVID-19, and yet 3 to 4 million people globally die of pneumonia, and that's just pneumonia without considering the vast number of other illnesses, that are passed on through transmission, that are infectious. Pneumonia is more often than not, it's as a result of a viral infection. In fact, that viral infections can cause pneumonia. And so I think there are my reasons for having my doubts about the measures as being justified. I know that's an ongoing debate at the moment. There are many different people, including virologists, that have reached very different verdicts. And I'm still looking at the evidence and the information that's coming in on a daily, weekly and monthly basis. And we should always be cautious about not being too absolutely sure that we ever have all the evidence, and that we are, when none of us are all knowing. Even experts in their field sometimes make mistakes, and certainly as lay people that aren't specifically trained in those things and are having to rely on various competing experts' opinions and views, we all can be prone to making mistakes, and we should all be trying to revise our opinions if we see evidence that does directly contradict what our own verdicts currently are. So we should pencil in those and not write them in pen, perhaps, and be prepared to arrange, adapt and change our beliefs according to whether new evidence emerges. So that's, I think, that's the preamble to what I really want to discuss now. And so I have my concerns that the international political reaction was certainly just an extreme reaction to the actual real risk and the harm of the alleged pandemic. To give you an example, in the UK, although it's reported up to 20,000 have died from COVID-19, Just a few years ago, there was a particularly bad season of influenza reported, and it was widespreadly reported here in all the different newspapers that up to 50,000 people had died during the course of our bad winter influenza season. It was a particularly bad epidemic at that time, and there were no measures, no calls for social distancing at the time. Over double the number of people died during those few months. At least that's what's reported widespreadly throughout the media. If you can accept those claims, I don't know why they wouldn't be true. They may well have died of a variety of different respiratory diseases, but they were all contracted through an infection. And yet there were no measures to quarantine large proportions of the population at the time. So it seems either there was an underreaction at that time to what was double the current death rate, or there's currently an overreaction that's happening now. You can't have it both ways logically, can you? I suppose if I look at it, I can see there's a good rationale and there's a logical justification for quarantining people that actually do have symptoms of an infectious disease. And I can quite understand that. If you have a viral strain of something and are exhibiting symptoms of that, then absolutely you wouldn't want to go out and mix with the general population and risk giving it to someone, but especially not to go out to visit people that had vulnerable and weakened immune systems and who are much more likely and susceptible to the risk of having that infection and not being able to get over it. So I think there would be sensible measures there to restrict and quarantine people that have symptoms of an infectious disease, and to be careful and regulate who visits people that are extremely ill and vulnerable and most at risk of fatality of an infectious disease, and perhaps providing staff with adequate PPE, protective equipment, masks, gloves, sanitizer, and the correct training as well. That would all help. There's good argument that we haven't done that and have neglected things over the years, perhaps. And if anything good comes out of this, perhaps that's just to be more cautious about the spread of potential infections. But I still do think it's an awful overreaction. And I think the long-term risks of the loss of civil liberties are still there. And I hope it's not something that continues long-term, because even in the short term, there are significant risks for at-risk groups. Just to give you some stats on that, just last week, the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, they gave out their weekly report. I think it was week 17. And so they said that the UK death rate had doubled what it normally is compared to the 5-year average, although it was comparable, admittedly, to some previous years. So it's not necessarily that significantly higher, especially if you take into consideration a 0.7% population growth estimate each year. So what we've got there then is a doubling of what would normally be considered the death rate. And worryingly, it's triple in care homes. And I do wonder why that is. There could be a number of different factors, perhaps. But only of those, around 8,000 or so were estimated or mentioned COVID-19, although that included suspected cases. And I know there are some disputes amongst some about how reliable those tests are in determining what role, if any, the infection plays in the cause of death. And because a large number of those people that had died had a long-term number of serious chronic illnesses that could alone have caused the death or played a significant contribution to it. However, there were 13,500 other deaths that didn't mention any suspected involvement or any tested, confirmed involvement of COVID-19 at all. So one wonders, how all those other 13,500 people were dying. And you would have expected perhaps less deaths, since a large amount of the population are staying in and staying home at more. So you might have thought there would be less murders, less cars on the road, less accidents, less drinking out, less fights. So you might have thought that, but there have been some worrying statistics reported. Childline have reported an increase in call volume to them, so of other crisis lines. There's been a report of a doubling of domestic abuse deaths and a 25% increase in the amount of calls to the domestic abuse hotline. That's just here in the UK, but there are other reports too, especially in countries receiving the measures of lockdown. They're all having reports of an increase in domestic abuse and calls to crisis line helplines. So there could be some worrying situations where people at home suffering the ill effects of isolation, of stress, anxiety. And also there have been a large number of hospital appointments and treatments that were cancelled here in the UK. I hear in the US and perhaps elsewhere as well. And that was justified because they anticipated just a flood of infectious patients coming into the hospitals. But just a week later, they were reporting up to 40% of acute beds were still empty. Half of hospital beds they were reporting were empty. And so those large numbers they were anticipating just didn't come in. And so we've been seeing large numbers of hospital beds here empty, and yet people with long-term illnesses having those hospital treatments and cancelled, So you wonder what effect that is having for people with long-term illnesses, perhaps at home, with less support, with the fear and worry of an alleged infection and pandemic, and without any treatment potentially. What effect is that having on other people? You worry about that. You worry about the mental health too, perhaps without sufficient support networks available to them. So there are various at-risk groups that could be suffering significantly in the short term. In the longer term, there are a much larger group of people that could suffer. And in the very long term, if it was allowed to continue for many years, we all, of course, would suffer in our way of lives, just from the sheer point of fact that we all depend on different social relations to thrive and to fulfill our lives to the potential that it should be. Social relations are a vital part of all of our lives, whether that's colleagues at work, friends and family, support groups, community groups, whether that's some people's religious groups that they go to once a week, whether that's meeting up with a friend for coffee and a chat, whether that's counselling and support groups, whether that's going out to the cinema, the theatre, the sports stadium, meeting up to the fetes, to the fairs, to the whatever the event is, all of those different and different events help to contribute and actually give our lives meaning and purpose, and are so really important. My special concern at the moment actually is for various people that are really very ill at the moment, and some of whom are not even allowed to have any visitors. And I just I hope that at least they're able to use some technology to communicate to others. But difficult and worrying times, to say the least, that we're going through now. But given all that as the wider context at the moment, and I wanted to explain my reasoning for that, but I now want to come on to discuss some of the results of looking into the backdrop of this and some real concerns that I've had. Well, just a few weeks ago, I think it was, that I came across this event that took place, and it was deeply concerning to actually find out about it. On October the 18th of 2019, there was an event that was hosted, and don't take my word for it, you can do a Google search, find out the information online about it. And it was hosted at the Johns Hopkins Center in New York. And it was said to be for the health security, and it was hosted by, amongst others, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The event was called Event 201, and something very curious about it all, really, there was a strikingly similar number of details that actually are so similar to the alleged pandemic that took place just a few weeks, maybe a month after that event was hosted. Just incredible. Well, they state, and I quote from their own website, Event 201 simulates an outbreak of a novel zoonotic coronavirus from bats to pigs to people that eventually becomes efficiently transmissible from person to person, leading to a severe pandemic. And I'm going to quote again. They also say, the pathogen and this disease it causes are modelled largely on SARS, but it is more transmissible in the community setting by people with mild symptoms. So there's a number of details there that are just incredibly coincidental, you might say. To take, for example, the fact that if you consider the time, just a few weeks before the alleged first cases in Wuhan, China, were announced, we had them role-playing this simulation of not just any old infection, but specifically a SARS-like coronavirus. You know, that alone would be pretty coincidental, but also that its alleged source they described within their discussion, their alleged source was to come from a zoonotic source, and specifically from a bat. Well, they mentioned too, a bat or a pig. Now, that's pretty incredible. Now, I don't know whether the reports that later came out that it came from a bat in a wet market, whether that had any accuracy or not. But the fact that it was later widely reported that the source was from a bat, and that they discussed and specifically mentioned within their role play a bat as a type of animal that the infection could come from, I find that just too coincidental. But it doesn't stop there. Oh no. In a 2019 Netflix documentary, billionaire Bill Gates predicted a killer virus could originate in China's wet markets to rapidly infect the world. Well, this is a report that came out from the Daily Mail on the 31st of January of this year, 2020. In the Netflix documentary entitled The Next Pandemic, producers go off to wet markets in China, and they claim that there are potential risks there in the wet markets that could cause a pandemic. Incredible. Now, I'm not really a statistician, to be honest with you. It's not my specific field of study. But if you consider the number of countries in the world, there's roughly 200, aren't there? I know China's a larger, it's got over 1 billion people, hasn't it? Consider the number of animals that are eaten in the world, could be hundreds, couldn't it? If you consider all the different types of insects, the fishes, the mammals, hundreds of different animals potentially. Bats aren't that common as an animal, actually. You'll find that there's hundreds if you include all the uncommon ones too. Then consider as well all of the number of different potential viral infections there are. There are a large number of different viral strains that are fairly common, in fact. Coronaviruses are just one type, a family of viruses, but there are many others too. Then multiply the number of countries by the number of different animals that are consumed, by the number of different common viral infections, and you get to a number that's thousands and thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands. You get to the most unlikely odds that could be a pure coincidence. Weird anomalies exist in life, completely extraordinary coincidences that boggle the mind. Things like that perhaps do happen. But then again, there can sometimes be very rational explanations too. Either he could be a prophet and a Nostradamus-like figure, or he was able to accurately give the details of these events before they actually were reported and emerged, because he knew what some narrative had already been planned, because he was in on it beforehand, and that could easily be the evidence for that, in fact. So and I'm not saying that is the case, but that would be a much more rational explanation, if you look at it, than the fact that he was able to sort of have some premonition and look into the future, perhaps. the fact that he had some privy to private information and knew something about the future, because there are people that had already decided what those reports were going to be. And I don't find that particularly surprising. It's quite potentially possible. I like to keep an open mind to all sorts of things. But you have to question that, don't you? What are the odds that somebody could predict the country, and that it would be in a wet market, and that it would be from a bat, and that it would be a SARS-like coronavirus? What are the odds that someone could get all of those details specifically correct? What an incredible, extraordinary coincidence. Unless, of course, it's not, and that those details had already been planned, had already been written up, and he knew that information, and that's how he was able to say it. All of which makes me wonder, actually, why you would go then and upload that information and make it public and upload it into the public realm anyway. I suppose there may be some sort of theology that they have, or belief system, where they think they have to give the information to warn those people that take the trouble to look for it, so that some people that heed the warnings and look for the signs, they're able to sort of safeguard themselves, and the only people that fall for it are those that haven't made the effort, and that therefore deserve it. I suppose, and I don't know that, I'm speculating. Or could it be arrogance, and that they assume that nobody would bother to do it, they're so brazen that no one would even look into it? Or that the few people that might consider the possibility of it are just conspiracy theorists who would be considered irrational anyway, and then actually to consider it would be quite an irrational and absurd thing anyway, and that it would be considered so irrational that it would even be beyond any real discussion of the majority of people, and that so many people would be so accepting of the widespread narrative that they wouldn't even want to entertain any thought otherwise, anything that would dare to contradict what they would think. And so it would just be assumed that the vast majority of people wouldn't take it seriously, and wouldn't even take any time to properly study and consider whether or not it's true anyway. So I don't know, but that's only my speculation of why you might upload and publicise such things anyway. Why else would you? And I don't know. It does seem strange that. I suppose the other theory might be that it's intended that some people would know, knowing that the majority maybe not, and that they would want to control the conspiracy theorists and have sort of double agents like David Icke, for example, who's a well-known one, who could sort of use that, and then he could sort of give all that information to them. And David Icke, of course, is part of a new age agenda to sort of like spread all this pseudoscience that he believes in, of contacting seances and communing and channeling spirits and all sorts of weird, crazy stuff. And so he very much has a lot of information that he'll use, but then he'll slip in lots of weird new age propaganda of his own sort of weird beliefs, where he's sort of communing with weird spirits that he alleges that he's in contact with and channels. So potentially it's for those purposes too. And who knows? I can't speculate beyond that, and I can't know everything about it. I can only sort of say things as I think, and I'm potentially sort of going into dangerous territory, but how I look at it in talking about things in life is that it's more dangerous not to talk about things in life, actually, and it's better to talk your mind and to say openly, here's what I think about different things, and here's why I think about those things. Different people can come to their own conclusions, but you certainly can't if you don't take the time to look at the evidence, to survey it, and to actually consider. And I just think, I don't know how else I can look at it, that somebody can have such accurate details about a pandemic just a few weeks before it actually emerges. How someone can have so many coincidentally accurate information. Because I tend to not believe in that many coincidences. I suppose it's watching so many police investigation dramas over the years that sort of taught me otherwise, that it tends to be that coincidences are there for a reason, and it tends to suggest there's a good reason for that. Well, if you look into Bill and Melinda Gates themselves, actually, there are a lot of different claims about them. There's so many claims that I've now recently been reading about that they invested into a GMO company called Monsanto, who are heavily invested into genetically modified products, and that they want to and are part of a consortium that are trying to spread this genetically modified version of foods on the public, and so they're very heavily influenced and invested into that. And so I need to do a lot more investigating to know the extent to which they are involved with that. But in terms of him personally, he was alleged to be the inventor of this Microsoft. And that's widely disputed anyway, whether he actually invented it or bought it from others that were, and sold it to IBM. There's various disputes I hear about that. And in actual fact, more interestingly, to give you his background, actually his own father and his family were involved in Planned Parenthood, Bill Gates' father. And so he had an interest in eugenics, I suppose. People tend to be, invested into what their family are. And maybe his family were cult-like and he was very much indoctrinated into that growing up. It's quite possible that those were his beliefs, and that, his father was very wealthy, successful, and those were the type of groups that he was involved in. I think his father was actually the leader of Planned Parenthood, actually, a very controversial group that actually promotes abortion as a method of contraception. And it's reported that there are ever-growing numbers of abortions each year these days, 20 to 50 million, 30 to 50 million, sorry. But actually, we don't know the actual number because there's a dispute about how many that there really are. One incredible comment I found that Bill Gates gave about eugenics, and he really talks openly about his belief that there are too many people on the planet, that we are overpopulated. You can tell that's his belief, and he's obviously inherited that from his father and his father's Planned Parenthood beliefs, because he talks about the world being overpopulated, and he's really talking about different methods to reduce the world's population. And in fact, I think on the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's headquarters, it even says as their mantra that they want to reduce the world's population. So they don't